Hello, it's so great to be with all of you here in this room, and we've got a group of people online as well. So it's nice to be here with you today. I am Carol Thaler with Great Lakes Biomimicry. First, I want to talk to you a little bit about the organizations that are bringing this to you today. First, the Ohio Aerospace Institute, where we are, works with government, industry, and academia to accelerate Ohio's workforce development. About a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, Great Lakes Biomimicry became a part of OAI. Great Lakes Biomimicry helps organizations find sustainable solutions by looking to biology. And the Aerozone is the area that we are in today. It's a geographic area around NASA Glenn and the Hopkins Airport. And their work is to create a national hub of innovation around in this geography. Okay, housekeeping. In addition to these welcoming remarks, we're going to have 3 speakers, and the goal is to have them end around 11 to 11:15. After the break, we're going to have a panel discussion. So when you're listening to the speakers, if you have a question, try and keep it in mind for the panel. If there's something that you absolutely have to talk about or ask a question right then, we'll take a few questions. The speakers will take a few questions. For those of you online, my partner in crime, Tricia Brown, will be managing the chat during the panel, and you'll be able to ask questions as well. For those of you in the room, the bathrooms are out the door and to the right. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. Okay, because there's other ones that way too. Okay, sorry. We did have a couple members of the press sign up. I believe Dan Shingler from Crane's Cleveland Business is online, which we thank him for that. And cleveland.com may be here or may be here later. So, great. So we'll get started. Building sustainable supply chains, meaning supply chains that are reliable, resilient, and build towards a healthy environment is why we're here today. Harvard Business Review in 2010 described corporate sustainability as an inescapable strategic imperative and a megatrend like globalization and the rise of information technology. Megatrends create persistent shifts in how companies operate and can compete. Indeed, HBR's strategic advice on the benefits of sustainable business practices was prescient, as recommendations are now moving toward requirements. New environmental, social, and governance reporting is now a requirement in the European Union. And what's happening in the European Union and the US will fundamentally change the non-financial reporting landscape. The new EU rules capture a whole host of companies that previously were not subject to mandatory non-financial reporting requirements. In the US, the Securities and Exchange Commission is also considering new rules, although they aren't as extensive as what is currently in place in Europe. I believe that vote was late last year. So we're going to hear more about that later. Influences of the Industrial Revolution can be seen here in a description of the 20th century systems. They were simple, they were linear, non-connected, wasteful, resistant to change. And what if 21st century systems became more like biological systems? That we used closed loop and became closed loop and zero waste. There was no long-term toxins and adapted to constant change. That's one thing about biology. Every living thing is constantly being challenged by the conditions that it's in. So how can we figure out how to adapt systems based on what biology does? So Where can we go? We can go to biology's 3.8 billion years of research and development. With a shift in thinking, we can ask biology how. For example, instead of asking, how can we keep this machine from overheating, we ask, where in nature is heat effectively managed? Then you can explore the technologies found in biology. And if you didn't know, elephant skin is a very good organism that manages heat. There's something called a desert fox that has huge ears. It manages heat because it lives in the desert. And of course, all kinds of cacti know how to manage heat, so you can ask questions of that. So how does nature demonstrate resilience? In simple terms, resiliency is the ability to recover from a disturbance. It doesn't mean recovering in the same way that you were before the disturbance, but most likely you would get into a new stable state. And in constantly changing conditions, finding ways to adapt is a must. So I want to go through a few examples of resilience in nature from a researcher at the University of Akron that is a global leader in biomimicry research. Oh, there we go. So for millions of years, sequoias were actually the dominant tree on North America and Europe. And that's because conditions then were wetter and warmer, and there was more atmospheric carbon dioxide. And as the earth dried and cooled, the sequoias died off, except some of them learned and adapted to survive in the conditions found in the Sierra Nevada of California. So Charles Darwin actually said it's not the strongest that survive. It's not the most intelligent of a species that survives, but it's the one that is the most adaptable to change that survives. So this is a diatom. It's a one-celled organism, either in marine environments or freshwater environments. And they have shells. I'm going to point to this. These shells are made of perforations and ribs. And these shells manage compression and stress in a unique way that the stress follows along the cracks in the perforations but does not affect the rib. And so it distributes the stress, and it becomes localized, and it doesn't ripple through the entire system. And so it makes us ask the question, are our teams, do you have ways to manage catastrophes so they don't ripple through the entire system or your entire supply chain? Camels, we all know about camels with the humps on their back. The food and water that they store there helps them in times of crisis. They can go 7 months without water. And so it makes me ask the question, does my team have alternate sources of what is our most vital resources? On the theme of questions, Boeing asked how can an aircraft move more efficiently? And so modeled after how many bird species that have upturned wings during flight, a winglet technology saves fuel by reducing the wingtip vortices, resulting in less drag. And less drag means less fuel. And so the winglet technology has saved the world's commercial and business jet airliners more than $10 billion or 10 billion gallons of jet fuel, which then translate to dollars. And it also results in a corresponding global reduction of over 105 million tons of CO2 emissions. So a little thing on the end of a wing, modeled after a bird, is reducing carbon dioxide. Parker Hannifin also asked, how can we build resilience into our product? So there was, from the stories that we were told by Pete Bucca, who was a leader at Parker, there was a client in Italy who was moving a very abrasive material through a steel pipe. And in fact, that material degraded the pipe And so that every 2 weeks, they had to shut the process down, replace the pipe, and, bring the system back up. And so the customer approached Parker with a request for a new pipe that was flexible and that could handle the abrasive material that was going through it. So they looked to nature to see what could be, they could find. And it turns out there were several biological organisms that had viable characteristics. So if you can think of a fish has got scales. Maybe there's something there with the scales. But they also took that to another level and worked with a snake. How a snake is flexible and how a snake can handle abrasiveness, because a lot of snakes move through sand. So that abrasiveness and the ability to deal with it was turned into a pipe, or maybe it's a hose. Sorry about that, Parker people. It now lasts up to 6 years instead of every 2 weeks. And in 2012, EY dedicated an entire New Horizons report to collaboration. And they looked to nature and how nature collaborates to find advice and find new insights to help their clients so they could come up with something a little bit fresh to help their clients. So the question would be, what would you ask? Now, our speakers are going to go through and share their ideas, but what I'm going to do now is introduce everybody so we don't break up the flow of the great messages people will have for you today. So first is Martha McConnell, the Director of Environmental Health and Sustainability at Parker Hannifin's Aerospace segment. She's responsible for the operational leadership as well as development and execution of the segments of aerospace segments EHS and sustainability. Oh no, I left a page. I don't know Paul by heart. I don't know where it went. Paul. Phone a friend. Paul, come up here and introduce yourself real quick. Love it. I don't know where it went.
Morning, everybody. Paul Sim, Boeing, Senior Director. I work in supply chain. Recovering lawyer. I was a lawyer back in the UK before I moved to the US and had the privilege of being able to work for Boeing. So excited to be here. And
nice
I'll
job.
hand back.
And Kathy, you're next. You could tell the future.
Hi, I'm Kathy Vale. I'm an audit partner with Ernst Young, or EY. I'm an accountant, which I'm sure is probably surprising most of you as to why I'm here, and I'll get into that a little bit later, but really excited to be here today.
Thank you. All right. Dave. Why don't you introduce yourself? I know, environmental lawyer, great guy, great friend. You can introduce yourself before the panel. How about that? All right. Now, we've gone through our big disruption, right? We're surviving. We're adapting. Right. Okay, Parker, Martha. There you go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I feel like we should start with a joke, an engineer, a recovering lawyer, a lawyer and an accountant walk in a room, and what do they talk about? Sustainability. Who would have thunk it? I'm really pleased to be here today. I'm Martha Connell. I've been with Parker an awfully long time. I'm a Northeast Ohio native, and I'm pleased to be able to share with you a little bit about Parker's sustainability journey and what that means to Parker as a member of the supply chain and what that means to our suppliers as well. So many of you know Parker Hannifin, but I also know that Parker, while we're in the community in Northeast Ohio, it's not necessarily a household name. So I'll spend just a slide or two introducing you to Parker and then also to Parker Aerospace. We are a Cleveland organization, over 100 years old. This year we're on pace to exceed $18 billion in sales. And our core space where we like to have our technologies is in the motion and control industries. On the screen, you'll see our 8 different core technologies. And we really try to stay within those technologies or adjacent technologies. We're a very decentralized organization, headquartered here in Cleveland, on the east side of town. And we have a very decentralized operating structure. So we have manufacturing plants in over 45 countries, and around, well, over 350 manufacturing plants right now. On the bottom of the slide is our company's purpose. This is what we introduced back in 2019. And as an organization, our purpose is enabling engineering breakthroughs that lead to a better tomorrow. And coincidentally, that also happens to be our sustainability vision statement too. And so I'll talk about that in a little bit. I currently work for the aerospace segment. I actually switched roles within the organization just this past fall. Parker's aerospace segment's also growing. We just completed an acquisition of Meggitt Corporation, or Meggitt PLC. We have 12 different product-focused business units within the aerospace segment and over 12,000 team members in 43 global manufacturing locations. In Ohio, aerospace has manufacturing locations in Mentor, Elyria, Cincinnati, and Akron as well. So we're definitely within the communities in Ohio. You might wonder what types of products does Parker Aerospace produce? I have this slide and one more. On airframes, these are just a sampling of the different technologies that we have, and we partner with our customers to put on airframes. Our braking systems is headquartered out of Akron. That came to Parker from Meggitt Corporation. Our facility in Elyria produces fuel pumps, but this is just a sampling of the products that go into different airframes, both commercial and military. On engine products, you can see some of the components that Parker produces. We produce valves in Elyria as well, and fuel nozzles is that business is based out of Mentor. So those are some of the technologies in the Ohio area as well. So what does Parker, when you say sustainability within Parker Hannifin, what does that mean, and why are we interested in sustainability? It definitely aligns with our company's purpose statement. Enabling our customers' engineering breakthroughs to lead to a better tomorrow is what we want to do as an organization, and that really speaks to sustainability. But we also fundamentally believe that if you do sustainability right and you align it to your business and to your business needs, it will drive value. It will also provide you a competitive advantage. If you help your customers solve their challenges in a sustainable fashion, that will drive value to your business. What do we do with sustainability? This is something that we continuously reflect on and evolve, and we have an annual process where we go out and gather stakeholder input. Stakeholders can be investors, they can be peer companies, they can be customers. We hear from our customers a lot. They can be our employees or our potential employees. I think sustainability is a really key element of both talent attraction and retention, and so that's something that we're also monitoring. So we have an annual process where we collect and do a survey of the business environment, the sustainability environment, including emerging regulations that you spoke about. We take that back and view that within the lens of our business and really decide what is Parker's sustainability framework and strategies and how will we deploy them. Deployment, we utilize our same corporate business strategy to deploy elements of sustainability. Within Parker, we haven't hired a whole lot of people that have sustainability in their titles. Rather, we really believe that this should be an expansion of scope in existing business structures, and we should embed sustainability into our existing functional silos and businesses. Our current sustainability framework, and I say current because this will evolve, but this is our current sustainability framework. Internal to the company, we think about sustainability as environmental, social governance, or ESG. And right now, our 3 environmental priorities for sustainability are climate action, water conservation, and then product stewardship. How can our products be more sustainable? How can we have good material compliance? How can we solve our customers' sustainability challenges? Under the social pillar, how can we have this, how can Parker be the safest industrial workplace? How can we be an organization that really lives and demonstrates diversity, equity, and inclusion? And then lastly, social responsibility. How can we be good community partners as well? Governance is about having a strong strategy, purpose, and values within the organization, aligning that with our leadership, our board of directors, and managing risk as well. I think that's a really important part of sustainability, is not just the opportunity that sustainability provides, but also understanding what the potential risks are to your own organization, your customers, as well as your supply chain. Underlying our entire ESG framework is communication and reporting, and that's about increasing demands for transparency and also increasing demands on data. Customers and stakeholders are really asking us for data, and data that's capable of being validated for how we are progressing among many of our sustainability pathways. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about climate action and how climate action affects us both as a member of the supply chain, but also at how we trickle that down to our supply chain. But I could probably make similar remarks about almost any element of our sustainability strategy. And I'll just keep it, my comments over the next few minutes to climate action. And I thought I would just start with a couple definitions. I know this is redundant for many people, but just wanted to set the baseline. We often talk about decarbonization or reducing CO2 emissions, but you will also hear about greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases include CO2, methane, nitrous oxides, 3 different categories of fluorinated gases. Those are the major man-made gases that help keep warmth or heat in the atmosphere and thus result in the greenhouse effect. Oftentimes you will just hear about CO2 emissions or reductions or decarbonization. CO2 is the one man-made, or I should say the largest influence of the man-made greenhouse gases. And sometimes the terms are used interchangeably, and I'll talk a lot about CO2 emissions, but you could expand a lot of the conversation to be greenhouse gases as well. First, emissions, we usually talk about 3 different scopes of emissions. Scope 1 are direct emissions. Those would be emissions that come from sources that are either owned or controlled by the company. So in Parker's case, you might think about it as emissions from boilers that we have in our factories or furnaces. Those would be examples of Scope 1 emissions. Or processes. If we have a manufacturing process that off-gasses CO2, that would be a Scope 1 emission. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions from purchased energy. So if Parker purchases electricity from a utility, the CO2 emissions from the generation of that electricity would be our Scope 2 emissions. And then Scope 3 emissions is where it really gets fun and complicated. Scope 3 emissions are any emissions that are upstream or downstream within the company's value chain. Oftentimes those are broken down into 15 categories. Within Parker, the most relevant Scope 3 categories are purchased goods and services, so thinking about our supply chain, capital goods, as well as logistics. And those are the areas that we as an organization have the most ability to influence and have an impactful or meaningful difference with. Parker has made a number of public climate commitments, and you'll see these on the screen in front of you. We think about 2019 as our baseline year, our last full year of production before COVID hit. That's why we chose 2019. We have publicly committed to reduce our absolute emissions for Scope 1 and 2 emissions down by 50% by 2030 and to achieve carbon neutral status by 2040. The supply chain, thinking about our Scope 3 emissions and the 3 categories I mentioned earlier, we're committed to reducing those absolute emissions by 15% by 2030 and by 25% by 2040. And again, those are just thinking about scope 1 and 2 emissions. A lot of the value that we can provide as an organization is going to come from product innovation and helping our customers succeed in their sustainability challenges. So thinking about supply chain, Parker sits in the middle of the supply chain. We are not a direct-to-consumer organization. So we have a lot of customers coming to Parker, asking Parker, what are you doing with regards to sustainability? And these customer inquiries and requests are coming faster and faster, and they're very diverse. They enter the organization through different pathways, through sales, through client relationships, through surveys. I probably have gotten 5 different emails within the last week from customers asking about carbon data alone. So this is just trying to represent the diversity of inquiries and the diversity of customer demands about climate that are coming to Parker. Certain customers are asking us to provide to them what are the metric tons of CO2 related to a single part that Parker is selling to them. And I put up the example of Volvo construction equipment. That's a request that Volvo has come to Parker with. Other organizations will ask us about what is the percentage of renewable energy associated with a specific product. EcoVadis is a framework, a framework for answering questions about an organization's sustainability program and progress, and we get asked by more and more customers to complete that on an annual basis and to provide them that information and that rating score. The CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, asks very detailed questions about an organization's commitments, governance, and performance with regard to climate action. We get asked about to complete that survey, to continuously innovate and improve our performance on that survey as well. And then we have customers asking us to make commitments to be net neutral. So it's a variety of different expectations coming to Parker from Parker's customers with regard to climate action. So what does that mean for suppliers to Parker Hannifin? We have certainly thought about that, and how do we pass those expectations down, or how do we partner with our suppliers to achieve these goals? We have also set 2019 as a baseline year to try to measure our suppliers' Scope 3 emissions within the 3 categories I mentioned earlier. And we're using a hybrid approach. We're using a spend-based approach to measure emissions, but then we're also trying to engage our top 500 suppliers and get direct data from them on an annual basis to understand how they are performing with regard to climate action. And we've partnered with the CDP to do that, and we will continue to have an annual process where we use the CDP, partner with the CDP to engage with our suppliers and to get data from our suppliers. Other areas within our supply chain that we're actively working on are logistics networks. We're looking to optimize our freight networks, looking to reduce or optimize both modes and ship loads so that we have optimal loads, optimal routes, transportation routes, and optimal modes of transportation. Within the supply chain, we're also asking our suppliers to evaluate risk, and as an organization, we're trying to understand what is the risk of water scarcity or climate action within our suppliers, and what does that mean to us as an organization? And then lastly, we're trying to monitor compliance with all the emerging regulations as well. So it's complex. There's a lot of data coming in. There's a lot of requests for data, and this is an annual effort. Within our supply chain programs, we have recognition for suppliers that achieve sustainable improvements or offer continuous improvement with regard to sustainability. And sustainability is one of the dimensions we consider when we consider suppliers to partner with now. I wanted to just reflect back on our sustainability framework. All of that work that I just mentioned with regard to climate action and our suppliers we're also doing similar work on the other dimensions. And I mentioned that earlier that this is our current sustainability framework. Internally, we're currently working on other aspects of sustainability. I'll give an example of waste conservation. We're collecting data to understand our performance and set goals in the future. And I fully anticipate this framework will continue to evolve and grow and mature. And as this framework grows and evolves, so will the expectations that we receive from our customers and the expectations we will flow down to our supply chain. And my last slide here is just a pitch for Parker's sustainability report. It's available on parker.com if you're interested in learning anything more about our sustainability report. And we will be producing a new sustainability report in August as well. With that, I will turn the podium back over.
Thanks, Martha. All right, Paul, come on up.
I won't take it personally.
I know.
So I think first and foremost, kind of what Martha just kind of presented there, I would just kind of say was a tour de force of sustainability. That was really, honestly, kind of amazing. And it was a great summary of a lot of the kind of things that corporates like Boeing kind of face into as well. So you're going to get some common themes. Sustainability and supply chain at Boeing. So I work in supply chain. I sit on the leadership team reporting to our CSO, so our Chief Sustainability Officer. But I also sit within the supply chain function and support the what's known as the Supply Chain Operations Council here at Boeing, which is led by our 4 principal supply chain business unit leaders. The reason why that's important is because, much like Parker, sustainability isn't something that's done in an isolated corporate function. It's something that we're really trying to kind of make kind of common to everything that we do. So, one, as we kind of get into this, just want to kind of re-emphasize the quality of the prior presentation, kind of really helps set the tone for kind of what I'm going to cover. But I'm going to try and take a slightly different slant. So, one, a little bit more supply chain focused, but also two, a little bit more focused on, hey, if you're a small business owner or you're part of a small business, what do you really need to be focusing on? What are the kind of the key themes that you should be taking back? And if you are the CEO, taking back to your leadership team. And if you're not the CEO, taking back to your CEO to say, hey, here are the kind of the key things that came out of this session that I attended. So with that, I'm going to go to the next slide, which turns out that I have the power to do. So this is actually a copy of kind of Boeing's sustainability report. Super interesting. I would probably not recommend that you guys go to boeing.com and download it, but if you're interested, you can. The reason I kind of being a little bit facetious is just because the nature of this is being driven by regulatory overlay around reporting that kind of, we're going to hear a little bit from our kind of E&Y audit partner. And it's of increasing importance for us from a regulatory perspective. Increasingly stakeholders, government regulators, and also financiers are looking at what are we doing in this space to make sure that we are going to be a credible investment opportunity for them in the future. Just a couple of kind of key themes that I would kind of note here is, for us, supply chain is actually not material from a reporting perspective. And it's very different from what you heard from Parker. So for Parker, their biggest kind of impact from a kind of carbon perspective is their supply chain. For Boeing, it's what's known as our products in use. So kind of we have airplanes that fly around, they burn gas, that is their kind of primary purpose. That is where we see around about 92 to 94% of our emissions, depending on how you do the math. Just one point of note on our sustainability report generally is you'll notice that it's not just around carbon. And that's really important. So, back to what Martha kind of introduced around ES&G, so environmental social governance. That is a mechanism that was devised by, I think, probably consultants and financiers for all the right reasons, to allow third parties to objectively assess across a broad spectrum of sustainability where a company is at, where they're heading, and where they are relative to their peer group. So that E, the environmental, which of course kind of decarbonisation sits within, is really important. And the reason why that gets so much focus is because when you look at commitments relative to net zero by 2050, that is where the biggest focus for us from a technology perspective, from a company perspective is. That is material. In terms of social, hey, what are we doing relative to our spend with small and diverse businesses? That's a slightly kind of, it's part of sustainability, but it's a different lens to look at it. And then finally, kind of governance. How are our kind of the companies that we do business with managing, the way that they think about corporate governance? To what extent have they got kind of diversity on their boards, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just kind of a quick kind of look at kind of the spectrum. Now I'm going to kind of flip to, hey, what is kind of Boeing's priorities around decarbonising aerospace? So just kind of back to kind of basics. Sustainability, ESG, I use them as synonyms. Technically, you're not supposed to. And there'll be some people that will say, hey, that's kind of heresy. But I probably a little bit of a kind of, slightly dumber than the average bear reforming lawyer. So I try to keep things really simple. So I would just kind of say, hey, for all intents and purposes, when you guys are kind of tackling with it, yes, you will find somebody that will say, hey, there's a distinction, and you should embrace them in that conversation. But when you're speaking to, back at kind of home base, whether up through leadership or down, I would probably just say, hey, for all intents and purposes, let's just say ESG and sustainability, think broadly the same thing, and think broadly speaking that the focus there is going to be something in the decarbonising space, but may also, depending upon your business, be important kind of from a story-based perspective. Hey, what are you doing in your communities? What are you doing with your supply base? Those are the kinds of things where you can see kind of that opportunity for more of a story-based approach. For Boeing, in the context of decarbonising aerospace, the reason why this is so important is because there won't be an aerospace industry if we don't decarbonise, or at least we don't have a path to decarbonising. And that's really, from a Boeing perspective, we've been on a growth trajectory over the past 100 years. And in the commercial aerospace space in particular, that growth is going to need a plan for decarbonisation. And so what you can see here is, when we look at our decarbonising aerospace, we kind of run into 4 pillars. One is fleet renewal. So the latest generation of aircraft can be anywhere between 15 to 30% more fuel efficient than the prior generation on a passenger distance basis. On the operational efficiency, that is all about how do you actually operate your aircraft. So where are there opportunities for kind of improved routing, kind of better opportunities to kind of move around airports, etc., when the airplanes are actually kind of being towed, for example, all things like that. And what you'll kind of see here is a theme around it is lots of little things that will come together to allow us to get to that kind of decarbonisation goal. On the renewable energy, this is a really, really important feature. And I'm going to kind of spend a little bit of time just talking about this. This is primarily sustainable aviation fuel. And for those that are not familiar with it, at the moment, our aircraft burn gas. They burn kerosene. Kerosene generates carbon dioxide released into the air. Sustainable aviation fuel is a kind of end-to-end process whereby, in one example, you take carbon dioxide from the air, you convert it using renewable energy into a kerosene-like fuel, which is synthetic, and then you put that into the aeroplanes and you burn it, so that from a net perspective, it isn't actually releasing any additional CO2 into the atmosphere than otherwise existed before. Now, the reason why sustainable aviation fuel is so important is that ensures that for us, we can continue to operate the large aircraft that fly in excess of 500 nautical miles. There is a huge push as part of innovation to better use electrical or hydrogen-based aircraft. The challenge is that there are technological limitations that do not seem as though they have a pathway to being kind of closed between now and 2050, even for new airplanes that will be introduced. And furthermore, that doesn't address the installed fleet. And what I mean by the installed fleet is the circa 8,000 aircraft that are currently flying. Sustainable aviation fuel has the ability to do that because it's a drop-in solution. And what that means is that you can, in time, increase the blend at airports from kerosene to being a sustainable aviation fuel alternative, At the moment, it's around about 2% globally. The intention is, hey, how do we get that to 50%, which our commercial aircraft currently certified to fly up to, but then also take that up to, say, 98, 99%, and ultimately kind of, potentially 100%. The reason I say ultimately potentially 100% is there's some nuances around what are known as aromatics. So there are some technical limitations on using SAF on a 100% blend that we're still working through. This sustainable aviation fuel is what's taking up a huge amount of focus from us as a company. Outside of the supply chain context, one of the biggest opportunities that we see is industrializing the capacity to create SAF and then enable SAF to be used. Oh, I'm going to do that later. Then finally, advanced technology. So just to kind of run you guys through, you can see there's a truss-based wing. So the airplane that has the wing and then the kind of the bottom bits of the wing that kind of up, that has the potential to deliver pretty significant fuel reductions. In addition to that, you have other technological innovations such as, oops, I didn't press anything, but just so you know, that's still good. Other technological innovations like open rotor engines, and also kind of things like autonomy, etc. All of these things are coming together to be that kind of connected system. And the next generation of innovation is going to continue on that journey of reducing the amount of gas that is needed. And I think kind of just back to the winglets example, we as Boeing started retrofitting our aircraft that are in the installed fleet with winglets that first of all kind of like bent upwards and then separately kind of bent downwards. And then we've introduced that on the 737 MAX as a continuation. The amount of fuel that saves was shared earlier. Those are the kinds of innovations that small things can make a big difference. And for aerospace, we've been on a journey for pretty much forever trying to reduce the amount of fuel burn. Because the more that we can reduce the fuel burn, the more that we can save our customers, the more that kind of correlates to kind of driving that innovation and that efficiency improvement. Okay. It is not working. No.
Oh, Adobe. Wants something. He wants us to download something right now. Oh, Lord. It went away totally. And here comes Craig.
Okay. There we go. Cool. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. I don't think it was me, but if it was, sorry again. So this is a bit of kind of context around kind of Boeing supply chain at a glance. So Boeing globally, this is 2021, and of course our numbers vary significantly depending upon kind of how many aircraft we're actually delivering in any given year. But you can see here a couple of key features of one, the global nature of it. So when we talk about resilience, Boeing plays a different role than many other companies in terms of thinking about who our supply base is, but increasingly with some of the challenges that we've seen through COVID, who our sub-tier suppliers are, what roles they play. Those are some really kind of complex challenges that we're going to have to face into collectively. You can see that our spend is around about $37 billion a year. Interestingly, or kind of fun facts, for Ohio, we spend around about $6 billion a year in Ohio. Ohio is actually the biggest biggest recipient of Boeing funding from a supply chain perspective in the US, period, even bigger than California. Now, of course, some of that will be GE related. They produce some pretty impressive products. Kind of it's pretty cool. In addition to that, the economic benefit to Ohio that we've kind of estimated around about $11 billion a year from Boeing being in the state, supporting an estimated 150,000 jobs, which is pretty kind of significant in the context of the broader economy. We realize the role that we play as kind of one of the primary OEMs in supporting kind of ourselves, but also the robustness of our supply chain. Beyond that, I think that the focus for me on this kind of chart is just like the geographic spread that we also have across the US, and the fact that for us, sustainability needs to be personal, because we need to be able to show up kind of where we kind of exist within our communities. And that's a mixture of kind of corporate giving, so we kind of have things like kind of corporate matches, But also, over and above that, we spend around about $4.5 billion a year with small and diverse businesses. And that's across the US, so that's just kind of US supply base. Okay, to sustainability in the supply chain for us. So I'm going to kind of cover this chart and then kind of get off the stage or open it up to any questions that there might be. This to me is kind of my supply chain sustainability on a page. So you can see a little bit of, hey, what have we done? You know, what are we focusing on this year? And then also what do we see in the future? First and foremost, I'd note that sustainability in our supply chain is nothing new. So we launched our supplier code of conduct last year, pretty recent. The reason why we took so long is because we kept having this internal debate where we said 90% of this on a side-by-side basis is already part of how we operate. It's already part of who we are. It's already in our contractual terms and conditions. Now, we adopted a supplier code of conduct aligned to the IFBEC standard, which is an industry-aligned standard. The reason we did that was to be part of industry. I think the role that we play is in helping kind of foster that industry kind of solution to some of these complex problems and making sure that everybody knows we are in it together. So with our supplier code of conduct, that covers things like human rights, it covers things like environmental, it covers the full spectrum. But it's not super detailed in that you must do this, you must do this, you must do this. It's more of a, hey, can you just agree to kind of be a good partner and think about these different things? And the reason why I kind of flag that is because for a small business, you guys don't want to be intimidated by having to kind of sign up to a code of conduct that obligates you contractually to any number of things that you're not going to be able to execute against. So we're really sensitive to, hey, how is this going to manifest for the small and diverse businesses? Highlights last year, we worked through the International Aerospace Environmental Group, which is an industry group representing over 70% of aerospace spend globally. It includes Airbus. And we were able to align on a sustainability due diligence standard. But what was really interesting about that standard is it wasn't just the standard, it was also the digital solution that was going to enable that standard. And that's where the focus for us, jumping ahead to the 2023 priority, at least in one instance, is so important, which is how do we roll out EcoVadis as part of that digital solution? This is a voluntary industry solution. So it's not going to be kind of mandated of thou shall. But the benefits that provides of everybody knowing how we are going to quote unquote assess sustainability within our supply base and being able to then kind of provide folks the ability to provide a upload of their key information that not just we can then extract, but also your other customers can then extract, hopefully reduce a ton of complexity and a ton of cost for all of you. Last year, and I've already kind of touched on the diverse and small kind of business spend. Last year, we also awarded, as part of our Supplier of the Year event, to Edison Energy. What Edison helped us do was get to net zero relative to our Scope 1, Scope 2, and that's really kind of important for us as a company, and also includes our business travel, which is kind of part of Scope 3. We're fortunate in the sense of many of our production facilities are located in places like the Puget Sound, or where they're not located in places like the Puget Sound, we have the ability to buy renewable energy from the local power generators. That's something that we're really proud of, and we're kind of happy to share. Now, we realize that we don't necessarily have some of the manufacturing processes and some of the kind of requirements on kind of burning gas in support of the production system, say Parker does. So we're in a bit of a kind of unique situation in that context, but it's really important for us that we kind of, embrace and live our own values, and that we also kind of share what that then is going to mean kind of for everyone else. The 2023 priorities, we are working closely to kind of get our suppliers to commit to our supplier code of conduct, or at least acknowledge that it exists. And the reason why I say the acknowledging that it exists versus, for example, committing to, is depending upon which kind of company you're in, you will have different lawyers with different skills, different kind of views on what you can and can't sign up to. And so for us, we're trying to make it as easy for our suppliers as possible to say, yeah, recognize this is important, we have something similar, or yeah, we agree to it. Any of those is okay. For us, the kind of the philosophy is making sure that our supply base knows where we're heading and knows why, so that it's not going to be a surprise and a kind of requirement for you to do something that's going to drive unnecessary cost into your business. The internal and external communications and foundational education. This is part of that, which is us getting out. And I realize sometimes, unfortunately, my presentation can be dry, even though I try it not to be. But it's about trying to distill what do we need you guys to know from us, and make sure that you understand in context why, so that you can use this as a kind of launch pad for making sure that your business is prepared. Because we don't want to be in a situation where our supply base basically is kind of limited to 5%, 10% of what it was previously, just because of the topic of sustainability. Instead, we're duty bound to make sure that everybody knows where we're heading, and also for us to think through how do we make it as easy for our suppliers to comply as possible, so that this doesn't become some kind of monumental task. It is monumental in terms of the decarbonisation. It is. But we've got to work with you guys to make it as easy as it can be. And then on the look ahead, for us, we're looking to kind of, again, amplify our message around industry-based solutions and industry-led solutions. We'll be doing that at the Paris Air Show. We'll also be doing that at the EcoVadis Sustain Forum. And we'll just continue to kind of, as part of this, where we go out to, the diverse supply base that we have, whether it's state by state or otherwise, to share a message. Also doing that at kind of more of an industry level in some of those marquee events. We're launching, and this may seem really tactical, but we're launching supply chain foundations training in the context of sustainability. The reason why that's important is because we've realized that a lot of our supply chain professionals, and depending on how you do the math, you're looking at 25,000 people at Boeing, don't actually know what sustainability is any more than the person on the street. And that's not a criticism. That's an illustration of me perhaps not doing my job particularly well. What we need to do is we need to make sure that our supply chain professionals are educated on the topic, understand it in the context of sustainability writ large, and then also can then start translating that into conversations they can have with you all, our suppliers, on where you guys need to kind of go, what you can focus on, and what's going to have the biggest kind of bang for the buck. And then finally, reporting. And I think this is kind of a good handoff to E and Y. Everything that I've said about trying to make things easy and kind of not over-rotating, I think needs to be viewed through the lens of there is an increasing kind of focus on regulatory kind of oversight, whether it's the SEC, whether it's the European Commission or otherwise. We've got some charts that can kind of illustrate just kind of the regulations that have proliferated over the last couple of years in terms of supplier due diligence, and also are forecasted globally. It's really kind of amazing how much has kind of been introduced. We are trying to take a very measured approach to how do we answer the mail in respect of those, how do we comply with those, of course, but also how do we do it in a really kind of careful way so that we don't end up creating kind of cottage industries of hundreds of analysts who are there to try and make sure that we are able to report the math on something like our supply chain carbon. And let me kind of give an example of this as to kind of hopefully bring this to life as to why we've got to be somewhat careful, especially in the context of Scope 3, so Scope 3 being the carbon created by your supply chain. I could theoretically do a spend-based analysis on, let's take a company that happens to be in Ohio that we spend billions with per year. And at the moment, they have manufacturing processes that result in their carbon emissions being, let's say, 600 megatons per year. We could theoretically say, hey, we want to get to net zero, and we want you guys to get to net zero really fast. They go and sell a manufacturing facility, and they outsource it to someone else. They then claim, hey, miraculously, I've managed to reduce my Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions to zero, or kind of, to effective net zero. We celebrate them. We say they're fantastic. We then report our Scope 3 emissions are now X% more advanced towards net zero than they were. It's illusory. And the reason it's illusory is because you still need somebody to go and smelt those metals, those raw materials, to allow you to be able to actually get the finished product. And so for us, what we're trying to be is kind of really kind of fact-based and not jump towards something that results in the perception of progress without actual progress. And I think most of the professionals that you deal with at companies like ours, and also most of the regulators and for sure kind of government, they all recognize the limitations of this. And so from a kind of small, diverse business, you perhaps don't care, or perhaps you don't have the ability to kind of care about that level of detail. But I think for us as a collective industry, it's going to be really important for us to think that through. So with that,
You've got to tell us your Game of Thrones now.
Oh, yeah, so I was kind of, we were talking earlier about, what would be the other kind of key message to you guys, which is, to use a Game of Thrones reference, and for those that aren't familiar with it, it's a fantasy TV show about dragons. Sounded ridiculous to me too. Then I watched it and I was like, yeah, definitely want a dragon. But kind of in that series, they kind of talk about winter coming. So it starts off with this kind of, hey, winter's coming, winter's coming. And they spend basically 8 hours talking about how winter's coming. And then eventually winter comes. And it's a little bit like that when you talk about the topic of sustainability in the supply chain. And kind of for all companies, where right now everybody keeps hearing about it, keeps hearing that kind of winter is coming. It is. Now, I'm hoping that it's kind of something that we can be so well prepared for that we don't really notice the transition. But that involves us having to take kind of action now to make sure that we're educated, to make sure we understand our business in the context of that broader sustainability journey. So, thank you for that reminder. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to move this box.
No box.
Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
Because I'm a little afraid I'm going to fall off of it, to be honest. So that would be bad for everybody. Good morning. My name is Kathy Vale, as I've already said, and I'm an audit partner at EY. Now, primarily my time is spent focused on a company's financial statements, but I also lead the audits of non-financial information, or this sustainability reporting that we've been hearing so much about. So I'm going to take a quick step back, and for those of you that are not familiar with EY or Ernst Young, we are a global professional services firm. We offer audit, tax, consulting, and strategy services. We have 390,000 employees worldwide, so we're pretty big. But here locally in Northeast Ohio, we have 2 offices, one in Akron and one in Cleveland. We have about 1,200 professionals here locally. We are the largest accounting firm, but like I said, we have more than just accountants with our consulting practices and strategy groups as well. But as I mentioned, I'm in the audit practice. I spend most of my time on financial reporting. I am a CPA after all, but I do work closely with our climate change and sustainability services group. And those professionals help my clients with their sustainability matters and support the reporting of all of this non-financial information. So we've already heard some of the sustainability terms this morning, and sustainability reporting really is requiring all of us to learn a completely new vocabulary. So if you're hearing terms this morning that are new to you, please don't be intimidated. We are all learning very quickly. Not only is it a new language, but we also need to think about how we gather that data and all the data that's necessary to provide the reliable and comparable information amongst different entities, because our investors and stakeholders, customers and employees, everyone is asking for this information. So as I was trying to prepare for how to present this information to you all today, I really started with the lengthy presentations that we are giving to our clients at their requests. And I tried to boil that information down into kind of a quick and dirty education session to help you all understand what we're seeing across different industries, and then more broadly, obviously, in the regulatory environment that we've already heard a little bit about this morning. So I'm going to start with just the evolution of sustainability as a business imperative. Now, in order to survive and grow in an increasingly competitive and accountable business environment, organizations are required to report not only that financial performance, but also this non-financial performance. And ignoring the sustainability, environmental, social, governance, climate change risks, all of these things, and ignoring all of that is really no longer an option for a company. But first, I'm going to kind of reestablish the baseline and talking a little bit about what is ESG. And we've heard, some of the terms already introduced this morning. ESG, as Paul mentioned, is really used interchangeably with sustainability, and you're going to hear me do that in and out of this conversation all morning. But sustainability, most people usually think of climate, so they're thinking of that E first. But you need to understand what underlies this whole ESG agenda and includes that social and governance aspect as well. So we're going to spend a little more time talking about the E this morning, and that would be the climate change, those scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions, energy efficiency, waste management, water management. That's all of those environmental factors. But I don't want to forget about that S and the G. The S, or social, includes your diversity and inclusion, your employee safety and wellness, employee wages and benefits. These are all those social aspects. And finally, you get to G. This includes board diversity, business ethics, and we also touched on this briefly, but data privacy and security, risk management, otherwise known as cybersecurity. A lot of companies are surprised to hear that that falls under that ESG agenda. So companies talk about these topics. Obviously, most companies are concerned with most of these topics, but they may not be aware that they're actually talking about ESG. And the ESG agenda and the motivations for ESG reporting has really shifted over time. So if you look at my little snake chart here, first we started in the old way of thinking where companies were focusing on philanthropy. And we are successful as a company, and therefore we give back. That was generally the old mindset, where now we have evolved to a new way of thinking, which is more of a fiduciary duty, where we're successful because we're driving value for our stakeholders through each of these metrics. So it's really evolved to that full stakeholder value mentality and a purpose. So the market demands from all these different stakeholders to communicate the ESG information, not to mention the demand for ESG information from shareholders and regulators, which I'm going to talk about separately in a bit. All of this has been increasing very rapidly in the recent years. Increasingly, companies are getting pressured to improve and enhance their reporting around ESG and sustainability. See, there I am using both those terms again, kind of interchangeably. One of those stakeholders would be, on the left side of the slide, would be the investors and lenders. So we've seen access to capital is increasing when ESG metrics are reported. One of the stats that I recently just saw was that there are 680 financial institutions with over 130 trillion in assets that are requesting information on companies' sustainability through the CDP, which is one of those organizations we heard a little bit about earlier, and I'll cover that in a little more detail in a second. So that is access to 130 trillion in lending and assets for companies. ESG metrics are also increasingly included in debt covenants and different financing arrangements and may unlock different financing through green bonds. One of my clients just refinanced their debt, and their debt covenants include employee safety metrics, which was new for them. So these are things that, again, covers more than just the E, but also the S and the G. Employees are also demanding this information, so a focus on sustainability can increase your access to talent. We're seeing millennials and younger generations specifically are very focused on companies. They want to work at a place where they're not just focused on financial gain or financial compensation, although that's still important, obviously. But they definitely want to work somewhere that's building towards a greater purpose, and they're asking for this information in the recruiting process. So of specific importance to today's seminar, customers are asking for increased ESG reporting. What surprises a lot of our clients actually is that customers often find publicly available ESG scores of potential suppliers. If the ESG score of a company is too low or there's not enough ESG information available, a company could miss that revenue opportunity because customers want this type of information to ensure they're dealing with companies committed to transparency in their ESG reporting. I've put some stats up here that recent data shows that more than 200 companies with 5.5 trillion in purchasing power are using the CDP supply chain program to request information from 15,000 suppliers worldwide. Now, when I pulled up this slide and I got this information, the presentation I gave about a year ago had those numbers at about 150 companies with about 4 trillion in purchasing power. So you can tell that this is increasing rapidly as companies are looking for this information. So now I've mentioned CDP, or the Carbon Disclosure Project, twice. So I feel probably time to take a step back and talk a little bit about what that is. CDP is a global nonprofit They provide a platform for companies to voluntarily report information on their climate, deforestation, and water security impacts. So this is voluntary reporting to an organization that others can go in and gather that information from. This voluntary self-reporting to the CDP is, however, not the only way that a customer can obtain ESG scores. So keep in mind that there are other ways to do this, but this is just one of the more popular ones at the moment. We're going to talk a little bit more about ESG rating agencies here on another couple slides. I do want to highlight, since there's been so much rapid change lately, that there is another stakeholder, the U.S. federal government, who's asking for this information. In November of 2022, for suppliers to the federal government, the Biden administration just recently announced the Federal Supplier Climate Risks and Reliance Proposed Rule. Now, it's still a proposed rule. It was only issued a few months ago. But this proposal is going to require that major federal contractors publicly disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, climate-related financial risks, and set science-based emissions reductions targets. Now, as the world's largest buyer of goods and services, being the federal government, this has the potential to have really far-reaching impacts up and down a supply chain. So just wanted to make you aware that, again, other stakeholders are asking for this information. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about who's asking for all this information and why they're asking for this information, but what exactly are they asking for? And who decides what a company should report, and how are the ESG ratings established? Basically, who's in charge of all this? Because it just seems like a lot is happening all at once. The sustainability reporting ecosystem is really complex. There are many different organizations involved that provide some type of guidance or evaluation related to ESG reporting. And people often refer to this as an alphabet soup because there are so many different organizations involved and all these different acronyms, and it can get a little bit overwhelming. This is in part because there's no one mandated ESG framework, and since there's no comprehensive requirements yet in the US or globally, hundreds of organizations have come in to try and fill this void. So I'm going to help try and get your bearings, although I know that's probably feels impossible. But I'm going to categorize the landscape into really 4 areas to start with. One being the reporting standard setters. That's in the top left of the screen. These are organizations like GRI and the SASB, and these standard setters recommend disclosures for companies that are interested in making ESG reporting. And because there's no required disclosure, these standards are voluntary. There are usually specific quantitative and qualitative disclosures included. Moving into the next category here, the international goals and guidance. These provide higher level frameworks. They are typically not recommending specific disclosures, but really more like the categories and different governance processes that companies should consider reporting. So of these, I'd say the one you might hear the most frequently is that Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That's getting widely referenced in a lot of the regulatory frameworks that are coming out, so that's one you might hear a little more frequently. The next box here is the disclosure-based sustainability scores. These organizations use questionnaires that organizations fill out to develop a score or an index in a particular area. So I already mentioned the CDP. The CDP would fit in this category, and that they have specifically a supply chain program providing information to customers who are trying to make more informed supply chain procurement decisions. And then finally, you have these rating agencies on the bottom left. These could be Bloomberg's or Sustainalytics. These take data from both companies that publish ESG information themselves. But I think more importantly, they also take broad third-party information and put it all into an algorithm and come up with a rating or a score. Now, there's no algorithm that can come up with a perfect ESG rating, and this causes a lot of confusion and divergence among the different rating agencies. For example, a company could get a really good score with one and a poor score with another because they're using different algorithms to come up with this rating. So it comes to a surprise to many organizations, and some of our customers, our clients, have been caught off guard by this, that they have an ESG score out there from these rating agencies when they've never actually even published their own ESG information publicly. But these ratings these rating agencies obtain that third-party information and develop these scores from broad-reaching information sources. So, for example, they could take media reports and industry information to develop the score. One of our clients, I heard a story of when we were talking through these sorts of topics with them, were shocked when we came in and showed them their score, and the score was based on some media reports on labor disputes that they were having in different facilities. So just a message here is that some of this information that's out there is not necessarily self-published or voluntarily reported. It could be pulled from other external sources. So it's important to know that. All right, so everyone's favorite topic is increased global regulation. And we've been hearing a little bit about this, and we heard even in the very beginning. So we've talked about how there's mounting pressure by the external shareholders that are driving this increased global regulation. And while these regulations will primarily apply to large public interest entities, onshoring and offshoring supply chain decisions are going to be further complicated by these regulations as we move forward. For example, not even mentioned on the slide, but one that is kind of recent is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is a proposed EU tariff on carbon-intensive products like cement and steel. So this is within the EU bloc. And it's going to make these goods much less attractive to import. And it's going to encourage companies to build recycling capabilities and source recycled items within the EU. So if you just think about how that changes a certain company's thoughts on onshoring or offshoring in that part of the geography, it could have pretty far-reaching impacts. Two of the more impactful regulations, though, we're going to focus on today are the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU, and the recent proposal on climate-related disclosures from the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, here in the US. First, starting in the EU. This is all very recent. In November 2022, so a few months ago, the CSRD was approved by the European Parliament. So this is all very new and everyone is racing to figure out what the impacts are. But the CSRD will require the preparation of sustainability reporting to be filed with a company's financial statements. So it will be marrying that non-financial information with the financial information on a go-forward basis. These requirements apply to entities established in the EU and those that have securities listed in the EU, but they also extend to apply to companies in third-party countries, so this could include US-based companies, if they have at least one large listed EU subsidiary, or an EU subsidiary that generates more than 40 million pounds in the EU, and the company in totality, the parent company in that third-party country, generates more than 150 million pounds in the EU. So it sounds very complicated, but it's actually pulling in a lot more US companies than we had originally anticipated. So it does increase that sustainability reporting requirement further than just in the EU borders. So the sustainability reporting required under the CSRD includes, among other things, quantitative and qualitative disclosures around business model and strategy, time-bound targets, including greenhouse gas reduction targets for 2030 and 2050, progress towards achieving those targets, and then finally, risks related to sustainability matters. Now, this includes all kinds of different topics, not just that E, but also some S and G reporting. So this is a very holistic standard. Jumping then to the US SEC proposal, in March 2022, so just over a year ago, the SEC released their proposal on climate-related disclosures. Now, after a very active comment period, which is standard practice for the SEC, they will put out a proposed rule, open a comment period, and allowing different companies and really any stakeholder to provide comment on the rule. And this rule was one of the most commented on rules in the history of the SEC. So obviously they have a lot of information to try and digest as they finalize the rulemaking. But they have yet to release that final rule. So we are all waiting very anxiously to find out how this all shakes out. The proposal included requiring some of those qualitative and quantitative climate disclosures in separately captioned sections of a company's financial statements, which are typically the statements that are filed with the SEC. So they're just expanding the scope of what would be included within those financial statements. And this includes disclosure of climate-related risks, transition plan and progress on that plan, board oversight of the climate-related risks, targets and goals, and the process for identifying and assessing those climate-related risks. The quantitative disclosures around greenhouse gas emissions that I mentioned that they're asking for are going to be including the scope 1 and 2, and then in some cases, scope 3, if a company meets certain criteria. Additional disclosures are also proposed to be included within a company's financial statement, so in the financial section of this filing, not just in the non-financial sections. And this is going to include the financial impact of climate-related events. So this could be how much did the company, or how many costs did the company incur because of the hurricane that hit. Those types of disclosures would be required. They'd also have to include financial impact of any transition activities. How much is this costing you to implement these new sustainability targets? And then they would aggregate this amount of climate-related costs incurred. The materiality levels that they included are lower than any other materiality thresholds included in other financial reporting, and I know that's me in the nerdy accounting world talking about how that's a really big deal. It's something that they got a lot of comments on, so time will tell whether it stays within the final rule. It's expected, we've seen in some media reports, that the commission might pare back this original proposed rule just slightly, and we expect that we'll see the final rule in the first half of this year, so they have another few months to meet that goal, but there really is no required timeline. They can take as long as they need to get the finalized rule. And this rule, just to highlight, I mean, this is solely based on climate. This was only on the E portion of ESG, but they do have on their agenda to release rulemaking, and they've introduced a proposed rule around cybersecurity, so that falls under the G. They are working on a human capital disclosure rule, so that would be the social. So while the EU is kind of putting it all together, the SEC has been working through these projects a little bit more in a separate manner. So, in addition to all of these, there are proposed regulations in the UK, France, Germany, Ireland, and Italy that would be incremental to what the CSRD has put out there. Here in the US, New York and California are already moving forward with their own proposed rules requiring additional sustainability disclosures. So these are just two, probably two of the largest regulatory movements, but there is a lot of activity, and it's going to be increasingly important for companies to understand the jurisdictions in which they operate to make sure that they're following all of these rules appropriately. Okay, so once we've scared everyone to death, we try and help you figure out, what to do next and how to kind of digest all of this. So, sustainability reporting really shouldn't just be a check-the-box mentality. Since there are so many ESG issues, the information can really be used to enhance your decision-making. So this shouldn't really be a compliance or a disclosure obligation, and it's more, you should really think more about it as something that can add value and can be incremental to the company's bottom line. And also to the achievement of its strategy and its mission, because remember, this incorporates a wide variety of information. The data collected could help you with process improvements or identifying potential efficiencies or cost savings. However, not every ESG topic is going to be relevant to every single company. To get started, so we've included some recommendations to help narrow down those ESG issues that are of critical importance. And the first being, just let's determine what's material. So determining materiality of a subset of ESG issues that are most relevant to the company and their key stakeholders will be important. This involves talking to your employees, your customers, and suppliers to get a sense of what's most important to them, because not every metric, like I said, is going to be imperative to your organization. Next would be, okay, now you know what's important, define some goals for those, and think about those particular ESG issues that are most relevant to you. And if you have a defined goal, you're probably going to need some metrics. So you'd want to identify what those metrics would be to track your performance towards those goals. Next, collect the data. So due to similarities between financial and non-financial information, we're seeing increased collaboration between our finance and sustainability functions at our clients in the sustainability reporting process. if you think about it, these groups already possess the skill sets necessary to aggregate data, report on that data, and track that data. So it makes a lot of sense to start using the different groups in your organization that already have that skill set, like finance. It can really help you in keeping up with the reporting requirements. And finally, I would be a terrible audit partner if I didn't mention that you should also consider getting assurance or having this information audited by a third-party firm. Some regulatory frameworks are going to be requiring this on a go-forward basis. It does add credibility to your data the same way that audited financial statements adds credibility and safeguards the financial markets. Having assurance or audit over this information is going to add some credibility to the ESG information as well. All right, so I talked a little bit about how we can boil all this down. I tried to come up with, some of the actions that you can consider to move forward. Sustainability is only going to become more of a focus for different stakeholders as we move forward. For example, we've talked a little bit about how the supply chains of the future will be more resilient. It's going to be more complex. Sourcing decisions are not necessarily going to be just about reducing cost, but it's also going to be focused on sustainability that adds to resilience. The pace of transformation in these supply chains models are going to be heavily influenced by all this government action, including taxes and tariffs and all the things that the regulatory frameworks that we've talked about. So it's important to stay up to date as to where all of that's headed, particularly, as I said, if you keep track of which jurisdictions you operate in, because the rules may differ, although they're generally moving along the same path. So prepare for what's next. To prepare for what's next, I'm going to say take just 3 first steps. The first being start now. To steal a phrase, the winter is coming. Don't wait for these sustainability reporting requirements to come and surprise you. And second, develop a sustainability reporting process. So just start thinking about, how to formalize the data collection efforts, leverage some of the reporting frameworks that are available, and use the different areas of your organization. Like I said, we are seeing a lot of alignment between the finance function, but there are subsets of this data all across your organization. It's going to be a matter of trying to formalize that data collection process. And then finally, just keep that stakeholder focus and materiality focus, because as I said, not every metric is going to be relevant to every organization. So it's really important to keep that focus on those that are most important to you and your stakeholders. So sustainability reporting, honestly, it can feel really overwhelming, and I'm learning new things every day, even though I've been involved in this now for years. But companies can start small, so just focus on those metrics and the things that are most important to you and your stakeholders. And just keep in mind that customers and suppliers, other stakeholders, lenders, regulators, they're all going to be asking for this information. So if you haven't heard from them already, I would just suggest that you just be ready for it, and it's best to be prepared.
All right.
I was instructed to leave it on that slide, so.
Nice, thank you. All right, we're running a little ahead of schedule, but I think it's going to be good to sort of kind of think about all the great information we've heard. Nice different perspectives on the same theme, that sustainability is real and it's positive. We have to report on it, but it's going to lead us to a better place. So we're going to take a break. It's about 5:11. Why don't let's be back here at 11:10. And so to those of you online, 11:10, we'll be back up and running. Thanks. All right, let's go. Thanks, everybody, for coming on back. We're going to have a great panel discussion led by Dave Nash, and you'll be glad to know I found my last sheet, so I'll always be able to read up on Paul. Dave has been an environmental lawyer for 40 years, and he's negotiated diverse stakeholder interests to achieve real-world business and legal solutions. His legal practice included environmental issues relating to advanced energy, emerging technologies, corporate sustainability, climate change, environmental litigation, and environmental enforcement laws. He is listed as one of the best environmental lawyers in America by the best lawyers in America. And a good friend and board member of Great Lakes Biomimicry, Dave Nash.
I appreciate this box because I'm vertically challenged. And I'm honored to be moderating this panel today. There were great presentations, and I hope we can have some fun. Supply chain is where it's at as far as I'm concerned with respect to sustainability and ESG. That's where all roads lead, whether it's the yellow brick road in the Wizard of Oz or the Silk Road from China or what have you. All roads lead to supply chains. And so what I'd like to do this morning, I know we have a knowledgeable and diverse audience. I would first like to ask if there are questions or comments from the audience. And if you could, Paul needs to leave for the airport by 11:50. And so, especially if you have questions or comments for Boeing and Paul, why don't we go there first? And if there are questions for other members of the panel or the whole group, that's fair too. So who would like to start off? Questions for the audience? If there are not questions from the audience, I want to warn you. I'm a lawyer, and I naturally slip into cross-examination mode. So if you don't ask the panel questions, the risk is that I'll go into cross-examination mode and be tougher on these panelists than I should be.
No. Please ask questions.
You won't let that happen? Okay. Yes, Danielle.
David, just want to remind you to repeat the question for.
Yes, will do. Okay.
So this question is probably for, Boeing and Parker. You talked about working with suppliers, especially Parker Hannifin, to support them. As we often say, like, your scope 1 and 2 is your customer's scope 3 at the very least. So how are you supporting suppliers? Are you providing resources? I know you're asking some suppliers to do CDPs. You mentioned Martha. Can you give us a little more detail? There are a lot of suppliers in this region who are thinking, oh, what do I need to be aware of? How can I get some help?
Well, I'll start. So as I mentioned in the presentation, we're really reaching out to our top 500 suppliers, and that's based on spend. And the expectation is, or encouragement, I should say, is that they complete the CDP climate disclosure. But that is a big ask. The CDP climate disclosure is comprehensive. It asks a lot of questions, requires a lot of data. So we also realize that this is going to be a journey. And it's going to be a bit of a transformation and lift for some suppliers. So to help with that, we are partnering with the CDP. So Parker and the CDP have held training and education webinars and events to help suppliers understand what the CDP is, what types of questions are on the CDP, what type of data would be necessary to answer the CDP, how the CDP is scored. So once you fill out all that information, the CDP comes back with a letter scoring and helping suppliers understand how that all works. We also hold supplier days, and part of our supplier days is really, it's a two-way street. We want to share information with our suppliers, and sustainability is part of those supplier days as well. So that's another mechanism for engagement. Those are, I think, organizationally done, but then there's a lot of one-on-one engagement too between our supply chain and the suppliers. Having said that, I think I would echo Paul's comment too that I think it might just.
You can just have it.
Yep, there we go. We also need to do a better job internally about educating our supply chain professionals so they can also be supply chain sustainability professionals too. So that's internal work we're doing as well.
There we go.
Okay, well, if I can, Paul,
Oh,
just
yeah.
for the record, Danielle, your question was essentially how does CDP would help suppliers?
And how do companies support their suppliers if they're
and how companies help their suppliers with their own reporting?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think that kind of Martha did a great job of kind of explaining, whether it's CDP, whether it's EcoVadis, whether it's X kind of company that is there to kind of quote unquote help us kind of interface with our suppliers. I think we're on a journey there, and I think that much like when you think about US taxes, which, by the way, I became acquainted to about 10 years ago, and it was like, whoa. TurboTax is pretty cool. And I actually think that in this area, reporting will become easier and easier and easier. Because I think that companies like CDP, like EcoVadis, and their peers will start to zero in on, hey, what are the pertinent data sets that they really need, and how do they extract those without having to have an army of folks at the suppliers who are actually collating that information and kind of making sure it's ready to be fed into the fax machine. Because that's kind of, unfortunately, kind of where we're at right now. So I think that that's going to be part of the winter is coming, kind of like, hey, if it's just far enough away, hopefully some of these digital solutions will get to a point of maturity where it's as simple as, hey, load all of my kind of energy bills, energy consumptions from our various facilities, and it kind of plops out a number. I think in the meantime, the education of our kind of supply chain professionals is critical, and it's something that I think we're really starting to turn our mind to, because a lot of our supply chain professionals want to know how they can have meaningful conversations, and we haven't really given them the tools to be able to do that. And so what I've noticed is if I go and speak to sustainability in certain kind of town halls or otherwise, folks will naturally gravitate towards, hey, I've kind of now been using the recycling and we've been able to reduce our waste from X facility by X%. And although that's interesting and it's important, it's probably not material. And that's kind of where, for me, I kind of really focus with our leaders, with our kind of supply chain professionals on trying to have that kind of materiality lens to what they're thinking about, what they're doing in this sustainability space. And I'd say the same to kind of the suppliers. And back to the, hey, one, working with industry to try and drive those standard methodologies, working with the providers to get us to a TurboTax kind of state, working with kind of regulators and kind of large customers like USG to make sure that they understand the fact that we can't burden the extended supply base unnecessarily, and then working internally on that communication education, and then also coming to events like this and making this kind of an expectation. Yeah, for myself, I kind of head up supply chain sustainability, so you probably expect somebody like me to be here. But in the future, what I would hope is that one of our directors that happens to be kind of locally, or senior manager, whatever it happens to be, is kind of here speaking about kind of what Boeing has done as passionately and as personally as I am here today.
Kathy, anything you'd like to add?
I would just also emphasize that, like just about any other area of expertise, there are professionals out there and professional services firms like EY, but a lot of others of varying sizes that can offer different services to help companies through this. And whether it's just education sessions, or you can get some peer benchmarking done to understand what's happening in your industry or what your peers are reporting. We can help with materiality assessments to figure out exactly what information is most relevant. We can do preliminary assessments, so not necessarily auditing what you have, but doing some preliminary assessments to kind of bring up the types of questions an audit would ask. There are different resources available if you don't necessarily have all that expertise in-house, because not everyone is a Boeing or a Parker that has that in their own organization.
So Kathy, at the break, I was talking with Carol and Anders Meiser, and I hope you don't mind me sharing this comment. It's not secret. It's all transparent. It's all about transparency and conspiracies in the open. Andrew and Carol paid you and your profession a big compliment because they said, we need more accountants in this space. Why? Well, one, accountants, like lawyers, are underappreciated professionals. And that's why I go see my shrink once a month. But the other thing that I think is really important is in this particular space, happy talk is not enough. Winter is coming talk is not enough. You've got to have evidence-based and data-driven analyses to make real progress in this space. So congratulations, Miss Accountant. You've got some fans here in the room.
Said no one ever.
Yeah. Andrew, do you want to comment?
So the other question is, how many more are you going to need?
How many more accountants are we going to need, says Andrew.
SEC is coming.
Oh, that is a question my firm is trying to figure out at the moment. We are currently deeply, we are anticipating the final rule here in the US coming from the SEC, because we know our current client base will then obviously have to implement these new reporting standards. And a lot of them have already started, so it's not that they would be starting from scratch, but like any regulatory requirement, it's going to require a diligence to make sure everything is appropriate and recorded correctly. So on our side, we are cross-training most of our existing finance accountants, so the auditors that we have in the field now that look at your books and records from a financial perspective, doing a lot of cross-training. That's how I got involved, to be honest, was one of my clients was much further along in this path, and I needed to get up to speed quickly. And I learned a lot about, switching from a dollar perspective to a metric tons of greenhouse gas emission perspective. But the fundamentals of gathering the data, reporting on the data, a lot of that skill set, does align nicely, like I said earlier. So, I just encourage any organization to kind of consider where this data lies in the organization and trying to put it into, just a easily accessible way, like whether you want to get a new system or, you want to embed it within your finance function, or if you are large enough and you want to go all the way and get a sustainability function. But, as we've heard already, it really makes more sense to embed sustainability in the existing functions and reporting because it really will touch everything in the organization.
Kathy, to what extent are you, and for Martha and Paul, are your companies using the SASB Sustainable Accounting Standard Board standards that they've developed and are developing?
The standard setting is evolving pretty rapidly. So SASB is one of the standards that we use. I do spend a little bit more time lately in GRI, or the Global Reporting Initiative, around some water withdrawal metrics and certain other E metrics that are out there, and the greenhouse gas protocol, obviously, when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. I think we are probably, if I had to guess, and this is my own opinion, I think we'll probably start seeing a convergence of some of these standards in the future, and the SASB and the international standard setters are already kind of trying to work towards that goal. But we certainly use all those existing standards today.
Thanks. Who else? Go ahead.
I think the alphabet soup. Okay, sorry. There we go. I think that the alphabet soup of standards that's out there, it kind of is, I'll be honest, it's super intimidating even for myself, and I'm kind of one of those cross-trained professionals, and I can't wait for the day that convergence kind of comes sooner. Because I think that we're putting kind of a huge amount of burden. And it's not that anybody's doing anything inappropriately or that they're not trying to do the right thing. It's that everybody thinks that they have a better mousetrap. And I think that we're going to get to a point where, in the process of time kind of going on, that maturation around the TurboTax, but also the rule base and kind of what exactly is measured, I think will kind of start to come into kind of, closer view, or kind of, better perspective. And I think that kind of links into also like the accountants, the legal kind of side of things, which is it scares me a little bit to think about the imposition of a small, diverse business having to go and hire lawyers or consultants or accountants to have to enable them to prepare for kind of the sustainability burdens that are going to be placed upon them. Because to me, that probably seems like it's a fail. And that's speaking as, the husband to somebody that owns a small, diverse business, and me knowing how difficult it is for them to just kind of navigate running their business. And so to me, that's going to be one of the key features of success. And I think that you all as small and diverse businesses, to the extent you are out there, speak loudly about the fact that, you can't afford, to kind of face into that. And it's really important, and it's incumbent upon those upstream to kind of make your jobs as easy as possible, because I think that you have a voice, and you've got to kind of make sure that it's heard, so that we don't sleepwalk into something that is just unattainable.
Thanks, Paul. Just 1 second. An anecdote following Paul's comments, if I may. We represent a global construction materials company, and I remember a number of years ago we got called in to essentially comment on the key performance indicators that this company had set up under using a combination of different standards, GRI, SASB, you name it, SDGs. And they were very proud to announce they had 641 key performance indicators. And it was just totally overwhelming, so a lot of our job was just simplifying that list of 641 key performance indicators. Miss, I'm sorry, your question?
This is for Parker and Boeing. From a supply chain perspective, do you guys think about sustainability from an OEM versus your MRO and aftermarket? And just, how much can your supply chain really do on the MRO side, given the specifications that they're working to that you guys have already established and have already been approved by the FAA, et cetera?
Great question. For the online audience, the question is, how do Parker and Boeing distinguish between their OEM part of the supply chain as opposed to their MRO part of the supply chain? How does that work?
So I can probably help with that. So MRO is maintenance, repair, and overhaul. And so if you imagine that you have a Parker pump in a Boeing aeroplane, that Parker pump will get replaced or repaired, say, 7-8 times through the course of that airplane's life. So MRO is really important for specific systems. Think of anything that spins or gets hot, it's going to need to get replaced, it's going to need to get kind of repaired, it's going to need to get maintained. For us, the distinction between kind of production versus, or OEM, as we kind of call it, OEM production versus MRO, quite often we will contract with companies like Parker to provide us with a pump or a system or something that goes onto our airplane. And as part of that relationship, we say, hey, we have certain expectations that we're going to impose upon you relative to how you support that product through its life cycle. And for us, that's really important, and the other guys do it, and everybody else that kind of operates kind of large commercial aircraft does it. It gives a level of certainty to the airplane operator that they're going to be able to get support, whether it's for spare parts, whether it's for repairs. We don't really distinguish between kind of production versus aftermarket in the context of somebody like Parker. And what we say is, hey, we work with you guys. You have obligations to support that aftermarket, and all of those environmental obligations kind of sustain and endure within that. Where things kind of get a little bit more interesting is on the kind of third-party MROs. So where you've got somebody who is using kind of like paints and goops and other things like that to maintain either at an airplane level or at a component level. And where we kind of focus on what those MROs is doing is, one, the existing regulatory overlay of what paints, goops, and other things you can do, as well as specifications that we include within our airplane maintenance manual, our component maintenance manual, that says that if you want to repair this part, or if you want to repair this part of the plane, this is how you must do it. And then embedded within that, we have a number of kind of specifications, and I'll be honest, it gets complicated. But that's kind of why we rely on a lot of engineers that exist within our company to make these manuals, but also engineers at these MROs to interpret what is required for them to do. If you take something like hexchrome can be particularly hazardous to human life. And there's kind of been a kind of desire to phase out the use of hexchrome because of the way that kind of chemical interacts with the humans. The challenges are that kind of hexchrome is required for certain uses on an airplane, in the same way that halon, which is a ozone depleting gas, is as well. And so there's a trade-off, and that's where there's a trade-off more generally in this context of sustainability, where you can't always kind of go all in on some of these things, because if you do go all in, you're going to find that you have unintended consequences that then require you to have to revert. And I think that's just kind of a balanced approach, where what we've got to be is kind of very deliberate about not trying to flick a switch unless there is a kind of end-to-end kind of system solution that everybody is ready to embrace, because otherwise you can just kind of create a whole ton of disruption and ultimately not really kind of move things forward.
I think you did a nice job of describing that relationship. I would just add the attribute that I think it's truly a partnership. you know, and I'll take again the example of Parker and Boeing, just a partnership between the two organizations. So as you move from a OEM type relationship and now you have that MRO type relationship, if there's a new innovation that you want to drive from a sustainable purpose, it's a lot of conversation and work with the engineering teams to see what is possible and prove those technologies. And again, it's a partnership, long-term relationships, but sustainability applies to both aspects of the business, and it's driven through both aspects.
I have a follow-up question then to your earlier comment about talking about the supplier conferences and the things you're doing for that. How involved are your engineer teams in those conferences as well, since they obviously will drive kind of longer term what you're able to do from a sustainability perspective?
Yes, the follow-up question was how involved are your engineering staffs in participating in conferences like this to help your supply chain?
They're absolutely involved, but I think they're probably involved in a different aspect than necessarily with the supply chain. They're probably involved with product innovation. The Parker engineers are talking to the Boeing engineers about what is Boeing's next evolution of their product and how can Parker support that. Or talking to the GEs of the world about if Parker makes this improvement to our fuel nozzle, what does that mean for the LEAP engine that then ends up on the Boeing MAX? So it's those conversations about incremental progress with material substitutions, with efficiencies, and so the engineers talking about that future goal that both of the organizations need to work towards.
So when I get reincarnated, I want to come back as an engineer because I think it is the coolest job out
Not a
there.
lawyer? Not a lawyer?
Not a lawyer, not a lawyer. Recovering, still recovering, never recovered. But yeah, no, engineers are kind of like the heartblood of who we are. So, Boeing's an engineering company, and we rely on our engineers to do all manner of things, whether it's set a specification, manage that specification, whether it's to actually create drawings, designs, et cetera, and then the integration of those. And so we work closely with our engineers to understand, for example, when you take something like hex chrome and hey, we're looking to kind of remove the use of hex chrome in kind of our processes for our kind of components, it all starts and ends with engineering. Kind of, hey, what exactly is that going to take? What is the engineering process? Are we kind of comfortable that we're going to be able to support? That is all an engineering function. And kind of, we say quite often supply chain is kind of the back of the elephant parade. And it still does feel a little bit like that. But increasingly, I would say there is a recognition that we need to be creating more of a feedback loop from supply chain back into engineering to say, hey, here are some of the challenges, whether it's yield, whether it's kind of manufacturability, or otherwise to make sure that what we're hearing from our suppliers is getting kind of integrated back into our design philosophies. And so I think that that's just going to continue. And also the digitization of business processes, et cetera, I think is driving us that way anyway. But I really do hope that when our engineers speak at conferences like this, which they do, they also kind of deliver a very consistent message of where we're at and where we're heading.
Great. Other questions or comments from the audience? Victoria?
My question is about pushback. What kind of pushback have you received from your employees or stakeholders when you implement trainings or if you send, requests for ESG information or reports to suppliers? What are you hearing back?
Great question. What kind of pushback are you getting from your employees or other stakeholders when you impose these sustainability requirements on your networks?
I think what Martha described is kind of we're going for a much more of a kind of permissive approach. I think that we're not ready for the kind of the stick yet, if I'm being completely honest, and that kind of feeds into the whole winter is coming. Is hey, yeah, it's going to at some point happen to us, and that's going to then kind of have consequences downstream. But I actually haven't seen much pushback at all from employees, and actually I've seen quite the opposite, which is more of a pull, where they want more sooner. And if anything, they're frustrated with the perceived lack of progress. And part of that is about us being able to do a much better job of communicating what we have done, what we are doing, and then also the limitations on that. That's kind of what I would say.
A very similar experience. I don't think we get any pushback from our team members. It's really a poll. What are you doing? Where are you going? Move faster, farther, quicker. So I think it's a poll from our team members, and particularly from earlier in career team members. I think I see a lot of interest with that population in particular, wanting to understand what is Parker's approach and how can they be involved. That's another thing I often get is how can I personally be involved in a sustainability measure or community responsibility activity. So it's definitely a pull from the team member perspective.
Kathy, what are you hearing from your clients, if anything, on that?
Well, I guess I would take a even further step back from even just my clients, but I was mentioning earlier, just some of the pushback that the SEC, for example, is getting on their climate rule. It was the most commented on proposal ever, which is probably why it's been a year since they put out the proposed rule and we still haven't heard anything. So they're still trying to digest all of that. Now, there has been a lot of support for it. It's not that all of the comments were critical of the proposal. There are certain aspects that are getting a little more criticism than others. I think generally most of it was supportive in just the direction that they're trying to go in. But this is going to be a challenge. There's a lot of thought that at least from the US SEC, that their proposal included everything. And they kind of understood that it probably wasn't all going to remain in the final, but they wanted to get it all out there and just kind of let the world digest it a bit. Like I said, we'll wait and see what comes in the final, but there is a lot of attention on this. And, so if you think about just from the macro level like that and the amount of attention that the SEC is getting, I can also bring it down to what I do every day. And, in my financial audit team, so those people from the recent college graduates up to myself as a partner that are now getting cross-trained in doing this, the amount of enthusiasm around that and the amount of people that want to specialize in this now because they find it so interesting, beneficial, it adds to their own purpose as much as the organization's purpose. I mean, that attention has been pretty astronomical too, so it really is much more of that push. We really haven't seen a lot of our clients hesitate in this space either. I think everyone is recognizing it's a business imperative at this point, and they're eager to get started, even if they don't necessarily know how to get started. So, back to that, winter is coming, people are around to help, but it's important just to start to get that, just start. I just leave it there, just start.
Okay, so winter is coming has been mentioned a lot. I didn't watch all of the series, but I do like the dragons and the whole winter is coming theme, but I think we probably ought to have a common understanding of what we mean when we allude to winter is coming. Paul and then Kathy, what does that mean to you in respect to what we're discussing today?
Yeah, I think kind of boiling it down, if you are and again, you kind of hear me talk about small and diverse businesses because they're the lifeblood of kind of US industry and especially the aerospace industry and will continue to be. A lot of these regulations that we talk about, like the EU CFRD or otherwise, don't apply and they won't apply. But their effect is going to kind of be pretty profound because what you're going to see is companies that do have to comply are going to start imposing things that either get kind of sent down by contractual flow downs or through evaluation of your kind of your bids in the future. And you heard from kind of Parker, they already evaluate sustainability in their bid evaluation. For us, less so. For us, it's kind of more of a, hey, do you have a environmental system appropriate for your business? That's probably about it. Now, where it's going is scores from things like EcoVadis and CDP and whatever it ends up being, the TurboTax version. If you imagine your credit score, that's going to start getting included in bid evaluations. Now, when? I don't know. And I think it's going to kind of vary by business to business, kind of customer to customer. But I would certainly say, hey, it's appropriate to be at least ready with, use the next couple of years to kind of get ready and think, hey, what am I going to do in terms of some of that kind of core reporting? So think about what's your energy usage, what's your water consumption, what's your waste? Do you know? And if you don't know, to what extent can you get a level of understanding around where you're at and also where you're going to be? And then beyond that, what are your stories? And, it's not very, objective to have, quote unquote, a very subjective story about what sustainability means to you. But those stories really bring to life where you are at as a company and what's important to you. And that's still going to be a critical feature of this scorecard methodology. So if you imagine you've got your credit report, but beyond your credit report, you've got a special letter where you say, but I'm a good person. That's still going to be the case for a period of time. So when I talk about winter is coming and I kind of translate it, it's basically that. And then for companies like us, it's that, but then a little bit more, where there kind of be a bit more prescription about how we tell our stories, how we report, the magnitude of that reporting. That's what we've got to kind of grapple with.
I guess for me, and what I do on a daily basis, I'm dealing with some larger companies. So for us, it's a lot of talking to our clients around what those regulations look like and how they're going to get ready for that. But then, to Paul's point, all of these questions that are being asked of the larger corporations, it will trickle down, where they're asking their suppliers similar questions with the goal of understanding that, Scope 3 emissions, for example, that will be reported by the largest entities includes the full value chain. So everything from supply chain on out. And so they're going to need some of this information in order to make the right decisions and reach their own goals. So I guess I would just kind of recall some of my last final slides and just thinking about, one, get started, but one way to get started is have that materiality focus. You mentioned recycling. That is wonderful and it is great and is part of what makes you, a good person or a good company, but it may not be material. So think about what's material to your company and focus your time and energy there so that you are most prepared when these questions do come to you.
Martha, I haven't heard you mention dragons or winter is coming, but do you have a comment?
Well, I never made it through season 1, but I do think the analogy is apt. This space is just evolving so quickly. It's a struggle just to keep pace with all of the new regulations coming and expectations, and the frameworks change year to year, and they're tweaked, and our customers' expectations change. I think it will reach smaller and smaller businesses, and so it's just being prepared and understanding how does your business interact and impact the environment. Within those impacts, which ones are material, which ones are the most meaningful, and then also just taking that landscape evaluation. What are your customers asking of you within your industry segment? What are the common metrics? So understanding your landscape is really important, and from there you can make a plan so that when you do get those phone calls or those surveys, they're a lot easier to start to fill out. And the surveys that come to you, you're not going to be able to fill out comprehensively year one from A to Z, and that's okay. Take the data you have, fill out the portions you have, answer where you do have programs, and it's a journey for Parker Hannifin. It's a journey for Boeing. I don't think there's an expectation that you'll be a sustainable company and have a new vision and data and metrics and all of that next year. It's a journey, but you need to get going and be prepared for that journey to start.
Tricia, you have an online question?
Oh, there we go. Yes. This is from Camille. She works at Airbus. Martha spoke about the current ESG framework, mentioning it will evolve. What are the next planned evolutions? How can we prepare for the future using the lessons learned from today? Any recommendations?
How many days do we have?
Well, I'll go back to our materiality assessment that we do every year, and I think that's a good place to start. So looking at what are the investors for Parker, what are they asking of us, what are the customers, including Airbus, asking of Parker, what are our peer organizations or industry segments asking of Parker, and that's going to help Parker be prepared for what's the next step in the journey. I mentioned that we're spending some time this year, our fiscal year, really collecting waste information. We have a very decentralized organization, over 350 manufacturing facilities, and we realize we need to do a better job even understanding where all of our waste is being generated, what types of waste we have, and where it's going. So that's a step we're taking internally now to be prepared for another priority that will likely be coming in our sustainability framework. Our framework is somewhat simple, but I think it's a starting place, and we'll be adding other elements as they become material to our organization.
Okay. Anybody else? Thank you, Paul. Paul's got to catch a flight to Hamburg, Germany in the next couple hours. So this is a very engaging conversation. I'm sorry. One of the things that is important to Great Lakes Biomimicry and the Ohio Aerospace Institute, unless there are other audience questions, is the mission is workforce retention and recruiting. And as Paul mentioned, Ohio and Northeast Ohio in particular is a key geographic cluster for the aerospace industry. Martha, how does Parker view its ESG sustainability strategy with respect to, we've talked a little bit about pushback, with respect to workforce retention and attraction?
I think it's a key element, as I mentioned, particularly with early to career folks. It's something as we go to college career fairs, we get asked about, who is Parker Hannifin, what products do they make? But then tell me about your sustainability process. Do you have a sustainability report? That's something that we get asked consistently, and it doesn't matter which function we're recruiting for. It could be a supply chain individual, it could be an accounting individual, but we get asked that very frequently from candidates evaluating possibilities at Parker Hannifin. Within the environmental health and safety function, I've just gone through a recruiting season trying to line up some new leaders to join our organization this June. And it's been an absolute shift in the candidates coming to the plate. I will say 10 years ago, I would get candidates with very heavy safety backgrounds. And this year coming to the plate, there are so many very qualified, talented candidates with environmental backgrounds and true interest and passion in environment. So there's a shift that I've seen over the last 5 to 10 years. And it's not just within that functional silo, but it's across different disciplines and candidates that we're looking to bring to our organization and keep in our organization too. So I do think it's a really key piece to talent attraction and then retaining those folks as well.
I mean, there's not a whole lot more I can say because even in just the accounting side of the house, we do see the same types of questions come from our recruits and our current employees. Everyone is very interested in not only what we as a firm are doing to be net zero ourselves, even though we are not in a manufacturing space, but they're also interested in how we're helping our clients get there. And as I said before, we're seeing a lot of our own internal talent looking to get involved in this space because they feel that it's important not just for themselves and their own career development, but for society and our company and in a much broader sense. It is very important the younger generations are focused on this. And we're starting to see that, in where we recruit most of our talent, which is out of business schools, a lot of those business schools are starting to incorporate it into their curriculum. So there is the business aspect of that we're seeing, and when I do interviews of college graduates, who are looking for a job, they're asking me questions about how it is we're engaging with our clients on these topics. So I don't think, again, it's not going away. I think that it's one thing that can help make you a differentiator, particularly if you're in a competitive talent environment, which I think almost everybody's in a competitive talent environment these days. It's something you're going to have to start talking about and be prepared for those questions.
Great. If I can, let's go back to the winter is coming theme. I understand all the regulatory stuff that's coming at us. But one of the things I hear from some of my corporate and government clients along the lines of winter is coming is not only do we have these regulations coming at us, but they're environmental community stakeholders. Oh, if we don't solve climate change in 12 years, we're doomed. Or if we don't do this by 2030 or 2040 or 2050, we're doomed. Do either of you see any of that kind of pressure coming at your organizations or organizations you work with?
I'll say yes, and it also comes from the investor community too. So institutional investors are very interested, and that is something that they communicate with their companies about their expectations. So it's coming from the investor community, certainly. particularly in the climate area, with strong expectations to have a strategy, to make public goals, to have science-based targets, and to then not only set goals, but then be transparent and show year-over-year improvement towards those goals. So it's coming from very different communities, and I think it's also, there's visibility at the board of directors level. So it's that level of pressure or engagement with organizations as well.
I guess the only thing I would add to that is, there's a reason that a lot of these regulatory frameworks, which I know that's not a direct question, but there's a reason why they're asking for targets for 2030 and targets for 2050, because I think there's a general recognition that those are some distinct mileposts that we all need to be focused on in order to reach the overall goal of reducing carbon emissions, or, pick your metric. So I think that, that macro, viewpoint of we need to fix this large, almost, insurmountable problem, we need to kind of boil it down to everybody needs to do their part by setting these goals to get to a certain level by these certain mileposts in the future, like 2030 or 2040 or 2050.
Great, thank you. I also want to encourage the audience, like I said at the outset, your questions and comments trump mine on my list. So at any time, if something occurs to you, please raise your hand, and same for our online guests that Tricia will translate for us.
We have a comment from Kaya. She just made the comment that more than 300,000 employees have been trained in climate change at Deloitte. That's a pretty impressive number, yeah. And I just have a general follow-up question to what was being discussed earlier is, Paul's not here to talk about Boeing, so maybe Martha, you can talk, to Parker. Is there an internal team at Parker when you have a supplier call you and say, we know all these things are coming, where do we start, how do we do it? Is there anybody dedicated to help usher them through some of this?
We have just recently added 2 positions, one here in Cleveland and the one over in Europe, sustainability analysts. And so those are positions that work both with the operations teams, our facilities scope 1, 2 emissions, but then they will also work with scope 3 emissions, so our suppliers. So we are building the resources that we have internally, but then we're also trying to expand the functionality and the education of our existing supply chain and your existing client or customer contacts as well. So the answer is yes and yes. If it's something you're struggling with, I do think it's appropriate to have those conversations, ask the questions, see what help you can get from your customers. I think that's an appropriate place to go. And we're building that pipeline within Parker as well.
Okay, and we're going to wrap up in about 5 minutes or so, I am told. So let me get to one of the key questions, at least in my mind, on our list, and that is, if either of you were queen of the world in your respective space, what would you do to improve your program or your clients' programs or your stakeholders' programs?
It's very tough because I could go in a million different directions, I guess.
I did lead the witness.
I guess I start with, if I think about what the biggest challenge is that I'm seeing in just helping my clients through this, is the data is everywhere. And so if I were queen of the world, I would love if there's just one depository that held all the data that we could use to aggregate this information quickly and easily. Obviously, that's not always possible, and not ever possible, but that would be, probably my number one wish list item. Just because without the data, you can't set the goals, you can't make the decisions, and you can't disseminate or communicate and report that information out to the world.
I think that's a great observation, and between data and then complexity, if we could take the alphabet soup that you mentioned, and Paul alluded to it too, it will likely converge. But in the meantime, there's so many different frameworks, there's so many different metrics. If I was queen for the day, we would boil this all down and have a common language and common understanding and key performance metrics that would help data collection, would help data storage and analysis. But in the meantime, I think it goes back to materiality, using existing systems to collect data, analyze data, validate and store data. But it is complex, and it's a lot of work too. It's a lot of work.
Yes, I just want to emphasize that, this queen of the world thing, if I had one wish, it would only just be around sustainability reporting. I'd have many other wishes. I'm not that nerdy, but yeah, that's a whole other seminar. So.
So last question for you. This may or may not be related to the last question, but if the audience needs to take 1 point away from your presentation or your discussion today, what would it be?
I think I would just say take stock of the questions you may already be getting from stakeholders, whether that's your customers or your employees, investors, lenders, whoever it may be. Just take stock of what information they're looking for, and again, put that materiality lens on. Try not to get overwhelmed, because that'd be really easy to do. But just focus on those metrics that are of importance to you and your organization.
Well, you took my answer,
Okay,
but it's really just doing your landscape evaluation, understanding your industry, understanding your customers' needs, understanding your environmental impacts and interactions with the environment. And then once you've collected that data, setting meaningful but realistic goals and start collecting the key performance indicators against those goals. It's complex, it's all-encompassing, but take this landscape and boil it down to what's meaningful and material to your organization and start there. You can always grow. It's a journey too. So start what's impactful and meaningful.
Okay, with that, we'll wrap it up. I want to thank our speakers, Paul and Martha and Kathy. I think it was great. I want to thank Tricia and Carol for organizing this, and for Great Lakes Biomimicry and the Ohio Aerospace Institute for sponsoring this very valuable program. So thank you very much.
All right, it's me again. The further thanks go to Cuyahoga County, who is supporting this work, and I think with our speakers today, have really advanced the discussion around sustainability in the region. So I definitely want to give a thanks to Cuyahoga County. Upcoming on May 10th, here at OAI and online, we'll do an event understanding federal incentives for shifting to green energy. On May 16th and 17th at OAI is the Ohio Global Aerospace and Supplier Summit. And in October, we'll have a conference on biomimicry transforming materials. So with that, I invite you to join us all for lunch. Hopefully you can continue the conversations, and hopefully Dave, Kathy, and Martha will be able to talk with you as well. So thank you for coming.